I love that these are the startup folding chairs.
Yeah.
Most of these conferences, they got the big plush leather venture capitalist chairs.
This is like, we run this conference like a startup, I have to tell you. So we just take just a minute to just give the audience just a little bit of background on your experience as an entrepreneur. Just rough sketch.
Yeah, so rough sketch. So I arrived in Silicon Valley without actually really having any idea what Silicon Valley was. I grew up in the Midwest and had heard about companies from the past like Apple. But came to Silicon Valley in 1994 when Silicon Valley was knee-deep in the recession of the early 90s, which was a pretty bad one. And a lot of Silicon Valley had gone dormant at the time. So it turned out to be good timing. It turned out 94, 95, 96 were good years to start companies. And so I've been here ever since. I've started 3 companies, 1990, one in 94, one in 99, and one in 2004. So about one every 5 years, which I would not necessarily recommend as a lifestyle to anybody, but it's certainly been a lot of fun.
So actually, that's a question I'm getting all day long, is about this like pending recession. And what's your thought on starting a startup when people are worried about a recession? And I think you started Opsware during the downturn, or during the bubble.
Yeah, we started, my second company, LoudCloud, was first called LoudCloud and then became Opsware. Okay. We started in September 99, so we timed it perfectly. We timed it at the very peak of the dot-com boom, so we had nowhere to go but down. It's exquisite timing. I have a couple of friends who started companies in March of 2000. They had even slightly better timing. We raised money in November 99, which was very exciting. We raised more money in June of 2000, which was like, June of 2000 was like in the cartoons when the cartoon character has fallen off the cliff, but it turns out he hasn't actually fallen off the cliff to the ground. He's still on the ledge beneath the cliff. And then the next step is then he falls 400 feet to his death. So the NASDAQ in March of 2000 had cracked and then stabilized, and then June of 2000 everybody went, oh, okay, everything's going to be fine. And so we raised money then, and then we actually took the company public in March of 2001. We were one of 2 IPOs in 2001, which was the year of sort of fire raining down on our heads. Ironically, it was us and it was PayPal was the other company that went public that year. Ironically, both were later sold for the exact same sales price, $1.6 billion. So both turned out fairly well, but that was again not an experience I would recommend. And then we essentially did a restart as a public company in 2002, 2003, and then ultimately turned it into a software company, which we just sold to HP. So that was a very specific set of circumstances. I would say a couple things. So one is, I think that so let me start up. I'm not an economic forecaster in any way, and in fact, generally I pour a lot of ridicule on people who think that they can predict the economy. For example, most professional economists and economic forecasters last summer said that the subprime mortgage crisis was totally contained to the subprime sector and would have no broader implications whatsoever for the economy, and certainly wouldn't affect anything outside of just subprime mortgages. And of course, that turned out to be massively untrue. So anytime most economic forecasters say something, you have to expect that there's a really good chance that they're wrong. And then when amateurs like me say something, you have to generally assume that they're wrong. That said, we seem to, from an economic standpoint these days, if you read the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times, which are the best business newspapers in the world, it's a little bit like reading the National Enquirer and the Star. For financial news, because it's so startling what's going on in the financial world right now. So basically what's happened is the credit markets, it turns out, the markets for debt, not equity, but debt went crazy between basically the dot-com crash and last summer. And there was basically, it turns out, a big bubble in credit, and a lot of that was associated with housing. And so what's happening right now in the financial markets is credit is being pulled out of the system at an astonishing rate. And so basically there's a credit meltdown in progress. Which is a whole fascinating thing in and of itself. Now, the funny thing about it is, our industry was like on the vanguard of causing the last recession. We are, in this recession, like the most removed from the credit bubble you can get. The one thing that startups in Silicon Valley, one of the things we have going for us is we don't generally use a lot of debt. And so, ironically, we're like the last, we're in no way a cause for what's happening in the financial market now. But it looks like what's happening is as credit gets pulled out of the economy, money's getting harder for big businesses to get. Consumers are having to pull in their spending because their housing values are falling and they can't pull more money out of their houses. and it's quite likely that will lead to more companies missing their earnings, like GE did the other day, which will probably lead to layoffs, which will probably lead to reductions in capital spending, which will probably lead to a generalized recession. And so, if you had to bet, which of course as an entrepreneur you're doing, you would have to bet that there's going to be a pretty serious recession for the next couple of years. And so, what I think that says basically is just prepare for it and make sure you're ready for it. And there are various ways to do that. The best way to do that is by having a business plan that doesn't require a wonderful economic environment in order to succeed, which is a good idea all the time. Another way to do it is raise money. If you're thinking about raise money right now. In the break, go out and get on your cell phone and go raise money before the end of the day. And so I think it makes sense. It makes sense to get ready for it. Here's the other nice thing about the kinds of decisions you have to make around this is, if you prepare for a recession and it turns out that everything is blue skies and sunny and beautiful, then you're going to be in great shape. That's a wonderful circumstance.
Okay. Congratulations, by the way, on the announcement yesterday.
Thank you.
Ning raised a lot of money on very good terms. So I'm sure everyone in the audience would like to know, what advice do you have for younger entrepreneurs or first-time entrepreneurs?
So I was thinking about this question because I saw it up on the board, and I usually have a lot of different answers on advice, but the single best piece of advice I've ever heard, I heard the other day watching Steve Martin, the comedian, on Charlie Rose. And Steve Martin, I'm sure everybody in the room knows who Steve Martin is, but he's one of the most successful comedians of the last 30 years. Across many different media, across television and movies and books and everything. He's been tremendously successful, and he recently wrote a book about, and it's actually really funny because it's a book about how he became successful, and it's not even a funny book. I mean, it's Steve Martin, so it's a little bit funny, but it's not like a comedy book. He actually sat down and wrote a book of like how I did it. And in particular, right, in comedy's a little bit like startups in that there are a few comedians like Jerry Seinfeld or Steve Martin that are like hugely successful, and then there's like, for every one of those, there's 10,000 others, who are still playing nightclubs, in very, very small towns. So there's a huge dispersion from the big winners to a very large number of people who work equally hard who don't get there. And he boiled it down to something that I think was incredibly insightful, obvious but insightful. Is he said young comedians always come up to me and they say, well, how do I be like you? How do I be successful like you? And he said, they're always looking for like, how do I get an agent, or how do I get booked, or how do I get on the Tonight Show, or how do I get a movie role? And he said, the real answer is be so good that they can't ignore you. And it turns out that, he just, and this is what his book talks about, is he applied himself with a level of discipline at being an amazing comedian. And it's really funny, right? Steve Martin's a great illustration of this, because Steve Martin on stage is incredibly silly. And he's got the banjo, and he's got the arrow. If you watch his footage from the 70s when he was up and coming, he's got the arrow through his head. He's like, dancing around. He's doing all this crazy stuff, and it looks like he's just clowning. But the level of discipline and rigor and practice that he put into it, was astonishing over a decade-long period. And then, after a decade of hard work, was a sudden overnight success. But the key point there being, be so good that they can't ignore you. If there's a forum like this and a group like this and efforts like this and my blog and all these things, we all talk a lot about the mechanics of how do you hire people, or how do you raise money, or how do you do this, or how do you do that, or how do you sell your company. And a lot of that, it's important stuff, but a lot of it is window dressing around the core sort of proposition, or the core problem, which is how to be so good that they can't ignore you. And in a startup, a lot of that has to do with have an idea that's so good that they can't ignore you. The best idea, having the right idea and having it at the right time and being able to execute on it is 99% of it. And the rest of the stuff that we all talk about, and I talk about all the time, is all kind of add-on and ancillary to that.
Speaking of which, you giving advice, I just want to make sure everyone knows, I'm sure you do, about Marc's blog. Just search for PMarca. It's just a wealth of information. So one of the problems that a lot of startups have, and a lot of companies are having these days, is just attracting good people. So how do you attract good people, but how, especially when you're a startup and you kind of have a crazy idea or might not have tons of funding, how do you convince good people to join on? And how did you and Jim Clark do that when you were at Netscape?
So the best way to attract good people is to not need them. So the best way to do it is to already be on track to be a big success, and then everything else gets a lot easier. So again, going back to the principle, be so good that they can't ignore you. Everybody wants to join a winner. So a lot of it, I think, gets to the core group of people who start the company. Because if the people in the core group who start the company are so good and have the fundamental basis covered to be able to execute on the idea, then it's a lot more comfortable for somebody else to join it, because people want to join something that's going to succeed without them. It's actually a lot of startups when they recruit, they're like, boy, if you come here, you're going to make a huge contribution and you're going to be incredibly important and you're going to help us succeed. And a lot of recruits think that that's terrifying, because why would I want to take on the level of risk going to some place that needs me that badly? Being on a track already to be able to execute and succeed is very important. A lot of that has to do with the founding team. A lot of that has to do with, in my view, the caliber of the engineers on the founding team, and in particular the founding team being highly engineering centric. Being able to build the product is overwhelmingly the most important. I mean, overwhelmingly the most important thing. The worst case scenario is you see this a lot, the business founder who's like, if only I could find an engineer who could build this thing, then it would be really successful. That's tough. That's really difficult. It's much easier especially if it's 2 or 3 really good engineers who like working together, who trust each other, and who have a good idea and can execute on it. And then it's much easier to bring in, to augment with the business people around that. I would say the best case scenario, and I learned this from Jim Clark when we started Netscape, the best case scenario is a pre-assembled team. My mentor, Jim Clark, started a company called Silicon Graphics in 1982, which, for those of you who haven't been in the Valley for a long time, Silicon Graphics was a very, very big success in the 80s and in the first half of the 90s. And in fact, in the early 90s was really the equivalent of what Google is today. It was the place where all the great engineers wanted to work. And in fact, the Google campus is the old Silicon Graphics campus. So history, it's not repeating itself, but it's definitely echoing. Silicon Graphics was Jim Clark, who was an assistant professor at Stanford, and his team of graduate students at Stanford. So it turns out he had a half dozen grad students in his computer science program at Stanford, and I think it was like the 7 of them in total, Jim and the 6 guys, basically started SGI, pre-assembled team. One of the reasons we started Netscape is because when he and I were talking about a company, one of the reasons he pulled the trigger on starting Netscape with me was because in that case, I brought a pre-assembled team, which is there were a team of about a half dozen people who I had worked with at the University of Illinois on Mosaic, and basically I said to Jim, I think we can recruit them, and I think we can build a company around them. And in fact, that's exactly what we did. We flew to Champaign-Urbana and we recruited them, and we shipped them out here in packing crates with lots of dry ice, and set them up in apartments, and we built a company around them. So having a pre-assembled team is absolutely incredible. It doesn't need to be. I mean, if it's 6 people, I mean that's extraordinary. It's more often that you see that it's 2 or 3 people who really like to work together. But if you've got 2 or 3 engineers who really like to work together, especially if they can get the product into a prototype stage without having to hire a lot of other people, then it's going to become much easier after that. The other thing I would say on talent in the very early stages that I think people underestimate is especially people in this room, the startups that are within basically 20 miles of where we're sitting right now, if you draw sort of a 20-mile circle around Stanford, there's a very large number of startups around here. When I observe them, they all tend to recruit from the same pool of engineers who are either already working at other startups, or a very common situation, you'll be recruiting somebody and he'll be looking at 6 other startups. And so it's like going trout fishing in a pond, where there's 40 fishermen show up when they're fishing in the pond and there's 2 trout in the pond. Those trout have a lot of degrees of freedom in terms of which hook they bite. So I think a lot of it has to do with being able to get outside of this very narrow orbit and be able to recruit from outside. And that's very tough because startups don't have recruiting infrastructure, and so it's easy for me to say go recruit outside. Well, how do you do that? How do you go recruit from University of Washington? You've only got 2 people. You don't have any recruiters. It's tough. Another thing that makes it tough is a lot of good people are outside the U.S., and so you try to recruit them, and then you can't move them here because of stupid U.S. immigration laws. And so it's tough. But when you see a startup that is on a recruiting bomb run, when you see a startup that's on a recruiting bomb run, they're doing one of two things: either they're fishing outside of the pond, so they're going outside and they figured out a way to do it, or they just drastically lower their quality bar, which is the other option, which I wouldn't recommend.
Speaking of that, how do you, as you grow the startup to be a lot bigger, prevent mediocrity from creeping in?
Right. So I love this question. I love because I think there's actually a way to think about this from a system standpoint. So my business partner in my last company, Ben Horowitz, coined a term he calls the law of crappy people. We focused on it a lot at my last company, and we focus on it in my current company. And basically, the law of crappy people is basically a derivation of the concept that A people hire A people and B people hire C people, which is kind of a cliche, and everybody kind of knows that. But the law of crappy people kicks in as you grow. And what the law of crappy people really is that the capabilities or the competence of the people at any level in your company as you grow are going to degrade to the worst person at that level in your company. And so your vice presidents over time are all going to be as bad as your worst vice president. Your directors over time are all going to be as bad as your worst director. Your engineers over time are all going to be as bad as your worst engineer. And the reason is because the way that hiring decisions get made and the way that promotion decisions get made inside a company is within reference to the people who are already there. And so I'm a manager. I want Joe to get promoted from engineer to senior engineer. My argument is he's a really good engineer, and the other executives who are battling for promotions for their people say, well, he's not that good. And then I say, well, he's at least as good as Bob, who's your guy, who's a senior engineer. You're like, okay, yeah, I guess that's true. Bob isn't that great, and Bob is a senior engineer, so clearly Joe should also be a senior engineer. And before you know it, all your senior engineers are as bad as Bob, and it's absolutely astonishing. It's absolutely astonishing to watch because it basically degrades. If somebody's significantly better than the worst person, they get promoted. And when new people get hired, they get hired in reference to the worst person to level. So it's basically on a level by level basis. And you basically need to just beat it back with a stick. I mean, you need to be so determined to not have it's another term that people use, the soft bigotry of low expectations. You need to be absolutely determined to have your definition of good not be the average of the people we have in the company, or the person who was accidentally promoted to a certain level who really shouldn't have been, but now that he is, that's the definition of the level because he's now part of it. And you just need to absolutely beat it back with a stick. And one of the heuristics I think you can use to beat it back is to ask yourself the question on every hire and on every promotion is, are you raising the average? Because you're probably either, if you're hiring somebody or promoting somebody, you're either going to be raising the average at that level or for that role in the company, or you're going to be lowering the average. And if you're continuously raising the average, which is very hard to do, then you're going to defeat the law of crappy people. But if you're not super focused and super determined on that, then it will inevitably degrade.
So how much do you think luck factors into a startup? I kind of hate this question because it's so hard to answer, but you've probably experienced some.
Yeah. So I think luck, I have sort of two theories on luck. One is that I think luck is critically important, and luck sort of expressed as almost randomness. There's a great book. There's a guy, Nassim Taleb, who wrote a book called The Black Swan, which has gotten very popular lately. He wrote a previous book called Fooled by Randomness, which is one of the most important books I've ever read. Which basically, he's a options trader, with PhD in finance. He's worked on Wall Street for a long time, and he talks a lot about the role of randomness in the world and the inability of the human mind to wrap itself around that which is random versus that which is actually causation. And we are sort of pattern recognizing creatures is kind of how our brains work, as we recognize patterns. And in particular, we recognize patterns when they're there, and we recognize patterns when they're not there. And so what this basically says is, in a lot of situations, especially in a highly complex system like capitalism or startups, there will be things that happen that appear that they're correlated, or it appears to be cause and effect. That company succeeded because that person is a genius. Or that company failed because that person is an idiot. Like they're easy and fairly obvious conclusions to draw. And his point is they could very easily be randomness. In fact, statistically, it's really funny. Statistically, you can explain the existence of even an investor like Warren Buffett by just thinking about the stock market as a giant coin flipping contest. And Warren Buffett is the guy who won. Just statistically, there was going to be a guy who had got 40 heads. And you can actually explain the existence of all the great investors just purely through statistical randomness. And you could probably, statistically explain all the great entrepreneurs through the exact same thing, which is very humbling. So everyone, it's important to realize that because a lot of the stuff that you hear, and a lot of the stuff that people tell you, and a lot of the way that history gets written, and a lot of the stories that you hear, and a lot of the ways that things are taught in business school or you read about in books on business, present things as if X happened, then Y happened, then Z happened, and therefore success. And there's a lot of, I think, sort of real-world evidence that that's not actually how things work, and in fact, randomness plays a much bigger role. And so randomness and luck, I think, are kind of the same thing. The other thing about luck that I think is really important is I think, to me, a lot of the randomness and therefore a lot of the luck with startups has to do with timing. If you think about, like, for example, social networking, if you think about Friendster in 2002, MySpace in 2005, Facebook in 2008, kind of the same thing at 3 years, spaced 3 years apart. Timing, and who could have predicted? In fact, I can tell you nobody did. When something is going to take, the internet, for example. Give another example. The internet had been in existence since what, the mid to late 1960s. So who would have predicted that in 1994 or 1995 would have been the year that the internet would have taken off as a consumer phenomenon? I mean, it just, it's just from a timing standpoint, completely unclear. And in particular for entrepreneurs, I think timing and luck are kind of the same thing because entrepreneurs, and speaking for myself, for sure, entrepreneurs are often uniquely bad at wrapping their heads around timing because entrepreneurs, by definition, are highly optimistic people. Because you have to be, because you're starting a company, and that you have to be highly optimistic if you're going to set off and do that. And you're probably so optimistic that you're probably too aggressive on timing. You probably assume that something is going to happen in the market faster than it's actually going to. And so sometimes what you see happen, you see the Friendster, MySpace, Facebook scenario. You see that happen a lot. You see a company fail, and then another company with the exact same idea 6 years later, and then it's a huge success. And it's just flat out simply timing. And I don't know what to say, I don't know in general what to say about that. In the specifics, there's a lot of specific things that I think you do to try to address that. You try to keep your burn rate low. You try to give yourself runway for the market to develop. You try to correct for the fact that you're probably being too optimistic. But I think in practice, that's a lot of luck. The entrepreneur with the idea at the right time is going to look like a genius. The entrepreneur with the right idea at the wrong time is going to look like a moron. And it's really hard as an entrepreneur to tell the difference.
Okay, so last question for me before we open it up to the audience. Tell me about one mistake that you see first-time technical entrepreneurs sometimes make.
Yeah, so this is kind of there are so many possible mistakes to make. It's hard to know where to start. I think the big one, I'm going to cheat actually and refer back to my previous answer. I think the big one is, the big one probably is, and it's becoming easier. So there is so much more information available today about how to start a company, about how to raise money, about how to hire people, about how to manage, about stock options, about all this stuff, right? There's events like this, 15 years ago, there wasn't. When I started Netscape, I went out and I tried to buy all the books on startups, and there were, I think, 2 in total, one of which is a very academic study of venture capital funding rounds from the previous 20 years, which I couldn't really figure out. And then the other was a book written by Gordon Bell, who had been the inventor of the DEC VAX, for those of you who remember mini computers. It was a book about how to start a new mini computer company, which he wrote in 1990 at the very end of the mini computer market. And so it's a great book. Still one of the great books on how to start a company. It's just 90% of it was not relevant to anything. And then that was it. And then the red herring existed. And so, but the red herring was 8 mimeographed sheets of paper stuck together with some kind of glue on the newsstand at Max's coffee shop in Palo Alto for $15 a copy. And especially if you were, just a programmer, you had to really, really, really want to read about startups to buy the red herring for $15 for 8 pages. Later on it went back to being 8 pages, but cost less than $15. Friends of mine in the room who worked at the Red Herring. it was much harder to get all this information about the practical, pragmatic aspects of it. Today, there's a ton of information available. I mean, there's books and there's magazines and there's websites and there's blogs and there's events and there's programs and there's classes and the whole thing. And going back to the Steve Martin thing, it doesn't really matter. All those mechanics don't really matter if the idea at the core of it and the ability to execute on that idea isn't present. It really, really doesn't matter. And so a huge amount of the time that I see some young entrepreneurs spending working on the mechanics and trying to optimize around the funding round and this and that and networking. And, the classic example is somebody who's, I want to start a company, so therefore I'll go meet with a lot of VCs. And they go out and they meet with 12 VCs or 15 VCs, and at the end of it, they have only damaged themselves because now all the VCs view them as like, oh yeah, he's the founder who doesn't have anything better to do than meet with VCs. He doesn't even have an idea yet. He wanted us to come up with the idea. Clearly, he's not a good enough entrepreneur to ever back. That's just disaster, and you actually see that happen. So bearing down, going into the garage and really focusing on the idea and focusing on the product is almost always the thing that people should do more of.
Great, thank you. All right, questions, everyone?
Hi, Mark. Thank you very much for sharing your brilliant insights with us today. And congratulations on your recent successes with Ning. 30,000 social networks and 1,000 added daily. So it seems that you guys are pretty on track to build a solid global brand. So my question is about your international expansion strategy. Right. Specifically, how do you guys plan to localize?
Right. So international expansion strategy. So we're definitely cheating. So we are. It's really fascinating what you can do these days. We have registered users in I think 230 countries. And of course, one of the funny things these days is what's a country? There are a lot of people in a lot of parts of the world who think that they're in a country that doesn't actually formally exist on the map. And it also turns out what's a language is getting to be a more interesting question. So Spanish-speaking Mexicans believe that they speak a different language than Spanish-speaking Spaniards or Spanish-speaking Argentinians or Spanish-speaking people from any other country. So it's actually even really hard to gauge how big are these markets and how many different languages and countries there are. But we have users who've registered in 230 countries. We operate entirely out of San Jose, California. We have nothing outside of even California, much less the U.S. We use Akamai, we use CDNs for distribution globally, but we don't have any sort of presence outside the U.S. We don't have business offices. We don't have servers. So on the one hand, we've done very little. On the other hand, we've opened up Ning so that end users can translate. And so if Ning isn't in your specific version of Spanish in some country that I've never heard of that doesn't actually exist, you can actually go in and translate it yourself and then submit that translation back. And Google's done that. A whole bunch of companies have done this now, and it's a method that tends to work fairly well. And then in addition, we're doing localizations in a bunch of different languages as well. So that's really all we're doing. There is a school of thought that says that that's a fairly irresponsible way to proceed because the global market is much larger than the U.S. market, and if you don't expand internationally, you don't get to a lot of the market, and you leave yourself open for startup competitors in other countries to, in some cases, directly clone you or at least be inspired by you or start other companies that do what you do in those countries and get entrenched. And then, of course, there are countries like China where if you're not authorized to operate, you can't even be used. You get blocked, which I think is probably true for us. Against that, against that are the counter arguments, and I would say two counter arguments in particular. One is focus. If for a startup management team, it's really difficult to do a lot of things at once, and so launching international operations with foreign employees and foreign offices and all the rest of it is a big time and money investment, and it may well be. And we think, at least for us right now, it's better to focus in on the core product. And then two is, at the moment, the U.S. market is still more economically viable than most markets outside the U.S., particularly from an advertising standpoint. Hopefully, that will change very fast, and I think there's a lot of movement in the market right now towards global ad networks and ad networks in different countries. And in general, as more and more countries around the world consumerize, if you will, and become more amenable to advertising and sort of consumer buying behavior, especially in the developing world, there will be more and more global opportunities. But we're definitely taking the strategy of that's for next year, not for this year.
I was just going to say, I was kind of surprised you said that because right now Google gets 60% of their revenue from overseas outside of the United States. The thing that we've seen in two different, and then I'll ask a question.
Right.
One, if you're doing development partners and API or platform play, let the local partners be able to, and then you just see who the winners are, the best, and partner with them locally. Right. Second thing you can do also is if you want dev out there, we found some real value with having architecture done here where the top cutting edge technologies and architectures are, and then letting localization for like dev, base dev, and base code in other spaces. I found Europe has some really good security guys, especially Estonian guys and Russian guys. Some of the best coders in the world, the Indian guys. So you just have to combine with the Chinese guys and all. Everybody's got something to bring to the table, just if you tie them together. But back to the question.
Yes, please get to the question because we have a whole line behind
Thank you. The question was... Okay. What do you see? What are the triggers that let you know when to go for a market and when to choose to be the first mover and get mind share over the fast follower? What are the things that tells you once you've structured your architecture, your company, and you got your logistics set up, when to go and when to wait? How do you tell that as a CEO?
I don't think. I mean, in my experience, that's not how the decision gets made. So, in my experience, when a startup happens, it's because somebody has an idea, and then they have a team who can execute on the idea. And so, as long as that's the case, people tend to go. Sometimes that's an idea that somebody else has already tried. Sometimes it's a brand new idea. More often, it's probably an idea that somebody else has tried, even if you don't actually know about it when you're starting the company. A lot of times, I see people starting companies. I've been around the Valley long enough now where somebody will pitch me on something, and I'll say, "Oh yeah, that's like Lotus Notes for the web," and they'll be like, "What's Lotus Notes?" And I'll be like, "Oh my God, I'm getting old." Or somebody will say, "We're going to do mobile payments, and so you can beam money from one phone to another phone," and I'll be like, "Yes, that was PayPal's original business plan," and they'll stare at me. PayPal's for eBay. I don't get it. So history tends to repeat itself, and so I think the decision tends to be: does the entrepreneur believe the idea is good enough right now, and does the entrepreneur have the ability to execute on the idea right now? And then if it's an idea that's been tried before and failed, in many cases that will work. In other cases that will fail. If it's a new idea, same thing. Sometimes it'll work and sometimes it'll fail.
We got to move on to the next question because we got to wrap up in a couple minutes. So next question, quickly.
Okay. I used to work for Mimicom, which became Totality. It was you probably remember them.
Yes.
It's
a competitor to LoudCloud called Mimicom, and we always refer to you as Mimecom.
Yeah. Oh, we probably deserve that.
Yeah. It's always good for a laugh on our own heads.
Furiously got a funny story about the name change, but anyways, LoudCloud at one point was burning through something like $50 million a quarter.
No, that is a slander. $20 million a quarter.
I'm sorry. I'm terribly sorry. So you're losing
much less than you said.
So you're losing $20 million a quarter. That's pretty painful. What do you tell your employees? What do you tell your investors? How do you kind of ride that storm out and talk to people and say, look, we're going to get through this?
Yeah, so you say we're going to get through this. Really we are. So let me back up for a second. So we were burning at one point. We were burning $20 million a quarter. Now what happened was, and this is behavior of bubbles and behavior of enthusiastic markets and downturns. Is for those of you who weren't in one of these things in '99 and 2000, to be able to buy or do almost anything in '99 or 2000, everything was in such short supply that you needed to make big commitments, and everything was really expensive. And so if you wanted to get appropriate volume discounts from people, if you wanted to get real estate, I mean, I'll give you one story. We had a 75,000 square foot building in Sunnyvale. We grew the company with like 740 employees, of which, I don't know, maybe 500 were in that building. The fire marshal was like 24 hours away from shutting our business down because we had packed that building with so many people. We were forced to go lease additional space. The only space we could find was a 120,000 square foot building, also in Sunnyvale, for like $6 or $7 at the time. for a minimum of a 10-year lease. And so the ultimate form of the story is we never moved one person into that building, I don't think, or if we did, a very small number of people. We almost immediately went from 740 employees to 400 and then down to 100. We never occupied the building. We ended up spending over $20 million just to get out of that single lease. But there was no other choice because literally the company would have shut down if we hadn't gotten the space. Data center space, bandwidth, be able to get access to networks. You had to strap on unbelievable levels of commitment. And so that's sort of how the burn rate compounded. So there was a lot of it that literally wasn't under our control. So what we ultimately did to get out of it was a sort of a Hail Mary deal, which was we sold the business that had all the customers that burn rate was servicing, as well as that burn rate to EDS. We sold it to a big partner, and we completely restructured our company in the process. And that was the deal that saved our company and let us turn into become ultimately a viable software company. So I don't know I'm not even sure to be honest what the moral of the story is. It could be, don't start a company in September 1999. It could be, don't start a capital-intensive company in September 1999. Let's try to apply it to today, though. My recommendation would be very careful today with what commitments you're taking on today. If we're about to go into the kind of recession that we might be about to go into, it's these kinds. I'll give you another generalization on this. There were a whole bunch of actually reasonably viable companies in 99, 2000, 2001 that actually went bankrupt through that time period in 2001, 2002 because of real estate leases that they couldn't get out of, and they were literally forced into bankruptcy because their landlords wouldn't let them out of those leases. And so, I can guarantee you these companies were high flyers at the time. They were not paying any attention whatsoever to any potential implications from their leases, and in fact, they needed the leases because they were hiring so many people. So this is a good pivot point like that to pay very close attention to what kinds of obligations you're really signing up to.
Last question, because I'm running late.
As an entrepreneur, I find your story very inspirational, which leads me to two questions. First, what accomplishment are you most proud of in your past? And second, if you could go back to your 20s, what would you do differently?
Well, let me take the second one first. So the question, what would you do differently, that often gets phrased as, what mistakes did you make where if you could go back in time you wouldn't do them again? And I think that's an applied version of the randomness point I was making earlier, which is, I actually never answered that question. I always encourage people to always blow off that question because you make decisions with the information you have at the time you make the decisions. And in particular, this is a big problem I have with how business school case studies are taught. If you analyze a decision after the fact with the benefit of hindsight, including the benefit of finding out how things turned out, you almost certainly would have made a different decision at the time with that information. But nobody ever has that information at the time they make the decision. And so in the military, they call this the fog of war. You go out into battle and you've got all these plans and you've got all these satellite photos and everything, and then 3 minutes after the start of combat, everything has changed and you don't know what's going on, and you still have to make decisions. And so to really, I think, appreciate and understand the difficulty of some of these things, in terms of looking back in history at how certain things happen in the military or politics or in business or in startups, is saying what information did they have at the time, and what would the appropriate decision-making process be for that lack of information. So that's why I won't answer that question. What I'm most proud of, the thing I like the most, the thing that I think I'm the most proud of always has to do with company building. There's a lot of ideas, there are a lot of startups, there's a lot of money, a lot of venture capital, there's a lot of things that people try. The actual process of building a company and going from that founding team to the 10, to the 20, to the 30, to the 50, to the 100 people, still working together as a team, a rising average in terms of skill set and competence, going out into the market, going broader into the market, going international, expanding, being able to have an impact on the world, and seeing the company grow and develop, I think is the most satisfying thing. And I actually view startups as sort of the ante for being able to do the company building part. Is you got to do the startup to get to the point where you can actually build the company around the idea. And I think that's the part. To me, that's the part that's the most fun, and I think that's also the part, for those of you who are doing this, I think that's the part in the long run that you'll probably ultimately derive the most value from and sort of feel the best about.
Well, thank you. Thank you. That was so